Okay, everybody, thank you. We're now starting our next segment. I have the pleasure of introducing Ellen. Ellen is a scientist emeritus at the Information Technology Laboratory at the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. Her primary responsibility at NIST was managing the Text Retrieval Conference, TREC, an international workshop series that defines the methodology and builds the infrastructure required for large-scale evaluation of search and related technologies. Her research focuses on developing and validating appropriate evaluation schemes to measure system effectiveness in these areas. Voorhees is a fellow of the ACM, a member of the ACM SIG IR Academy, and has been elected as a fellow of the Washington Academy of Sciences. She has published numerous articles on information retrieval techniques and evaluation methodologies, and serves on the review boards of several journals and conferences. Thank you, Ellen, for being here.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you. Okay, so this is going to be somewhat different from the previous two talks. So for one thing, I am not a search engine builder. I have spent almost all of my career in research, and the vast majority of it has been in evaluating search, but evaluating search in an offline paradigm, and I'll get to that in a minute. But right now I'm going to sort of explain this title first. So battling the Matthew effect. The Matthew effect is basically this idea that the rich get richer. And it's search engines are now sort of mediating in a two-sided marketplace. Historically, search engines have been thought of as you have a user come to your search engine and you want to give that user relevant items. And I'll probably call them documents because I'm used to calling the things that search engines return documents, but whatever, right? You're trying to return relevant items to your user, right? But that's less and less of that's too incomplete of a picture now for the life of a search engine, because your search engine has information producers, right? So if you are, say, the Spotify, and you're trying to recommend music to your users, that's all well and good, but you have a responsibility to your artists also to give them appropriate exposure, right? And so this is the balancing act here that you're trying to do, is you want to expose relevant information to your consumers, but at the same time you want to have your producers be fairly treated as well, where fairly treated here is going to amount to that they get the amount of exposure that they deserve, okay? So that's the Matthew principle. So who am I? And you just heard that long bio, so you know a lot of this. But let me focus here on TREC. TREC has been going on for a long time. TREC started in 1992, which I will point out is before web search engines. Okay, so we've been going on for a long time now, and what TREC does is build test collections. Test collections you can think of test collections as sort of a benchmark task. So it's a static collection, generally, almost always, a static collection of documents, queries, and then relevance judgments. So these will be explicit relevance judgments that say which documents should be retrieved for which queries. And given these test collections, you can then compare different retrieval algorithms by how well they work on these collections. There's a lot of work that goes into how do you get a collection that is of high enough quality that you would want to believe the results, right? So especially as document set sizes get larger, you can't have humans look at all of the documents, which is when this is sort of the Cranfield paradigm, I think, Cranfield paradigm here. When Cranfield started, Cyril Cleverton was the person who first suggested this test collection idea. He was insistent that to have a fair test, I shouldn't use fair there, to have a good test, You had to have all documents judged by a human for each query. Obviously, if you're going to do that, you're going to have very tiny test collections because humans can't do that. And even if they could do that, by the time they got done, they would be inconsistent, right? So you can't have humans spending, literally years to build a test collection, a non-starter. And so what's part of the stuff that Trek has looked at is how do you build these test collections when you can only evaluate a sample. You can only get human judgments for a fairly small sample of the entire collection. And some of this goes back to what Simon was talking about of it's pretty easy to ignore the easy no's, right? But it's finding those documents which look like they might be relevant, but in fact aren't, or those that actually aren't very similar to the query, but are in fact nonetheless still relevant, right? So we're trying to find within this big collection building the ways of getting a good sample of documents to run these tests on. That's all I'm going to say about evaluation within this offline paradigm. There's a whole bunch I could say about it, but what we need to make sure of when you are doing offline evaluation is you have to pay attention to a lot of these things about the quality of the test collection that you're using and how appropriate it is for the problem that you are actually trying to solve. But that's a different talk. This talk, I'm going to focus on, there was within Trek, the Trek has a set of different tracks. Tracks are sort of like sub-problems within the search space, which Trek does a deep dive into how do you evaluate this type of problem. And for the past several years, from 2019 to 2022, Trek had a track called the Fair Ranking Track. And it was explicitly looking at this problem of how do we get consumers and producers of information to both be satisfied in this search process. NTCIR is, you can think of NTCIR as the Japanese version of Trek. Okay, so it's been running for a while now too. The Trek tracks ended last year, but NTCIR still has a fair ranking track, and this one is focused specifically on the web, which the Trek one was not, and I'll get into what the Trek one was in a minute because that will inform what I'm going to say later. But the explicit goal in the Trek fair ranking track was to build systems that provided fair exposure to consumers, where the exposure was what documents the consumer saw. And you had to do fair exposure, meaning the consumer was still getting relevant information, but the producers were diversified within the constraint that it had to be relevant information.
So is it a diversity ranking problem?
It is different from diversity ranking, because, or at least, no, let me back up on that. It is different from the way Trek has historically interpreted diversity, because that was focused much more on, Trek did have, within the web track, Trek had a diversity ranking problem. And there it was focusing on how do you handle ambiguous queries, and how do you provide the user, it was still focused on the user, how do you provide the user the appropriate space of what this question might possibly have been. That is what historically the Trek, the information retrieval literature frequently uses that as diversity ranking. The fairness is different from that in that it's now trying. The relevance basically is assumed, right? So you want to assume that you now have a set of relevant items, and you want to make sure that those of that set of relevant items, if they were produced by different producers, that span of producers gets a fair shot at being represented in the results. In the first 2 years of the track, the problem was focused on academic paper search. Right, so that was what the systems were supposed to be, ranking academic papers with respect to a query. They were given the system was given a query. They were supposed to rank the academic papers such that they would be relevant. The corpus used was the Semantic Scholar open corpus. And the fairness attribute, the thing that you were going to see whether or not the systems were fair over, was the economic status of the author's country. Or, in a different formulation, the author's H-index, right? Because part of the problem with academic papers in particular is the higher the author's H-index, usually it means the more famous the author is. The more famous the author is, the more likely that paper is to be retrieved, which gets precisely to this Matthew effect, right? As soon as you're well-known, you keep getting well-knowner, right? So it's more and more and more, and that's not what we wanted here, right? You want to give the struggling PI who has just started a shot at getting their paper in the top rankings. Yeah.
On the more polymorph papers from those high H-index authors and also the higher IMF countries. So how do you account for that? Because if they're a lot more common in the corpus, they're going to come back more often.
That was for the participants to deal with.
Okay, so they would maybe do like stratify sample on them?
Or whatever they wanted to do, and I'm not going to. Quite frankly, I'm not going to get into what they did do, and partly because I don't have time, but more because I don't know. I mean, I don't know what all the participants did. But the idea here was that you were supposed to retrieve relevant papers, but within the relevant papers, you were supposed to also have individual authors should occur regularly in the results. In 2021 and 2022, we changed what the task was. In this case, it was prioritizing Wikimedia articles for editing. And in fact, it was targeted at the editor, right? So you want to suggest articles to be edited by some particular editor. And the fairness attribute here was the geographical location of the subject of the article, okay? So, and largely this was, we were trying to get rid of the US-centric nature of the articles being produced in Wikipedia. So, okay, let me go on this. So, most of this talk is based on this monograph, which was published by the Fair Ranking track co-organizers, which is called Fairness in Information Access Systems. And there's also two other papers. The top one, the first one there, is by the NTCIR track coordinators, and that just came out much more recent. The book was published very late last year. The paper by Tetsuya Sakai just came out like a month and a half ago. And there's an older paper, though, and that's the bottom one, and that was also has lots of the same authors of this monograph. But that's specifically looking at an operating system, an operational system, on how to audit to see how the fairness is going. But as I say, most of my talk here now is going to be based on this monograph. So the foundational work in fairness, in algorithmic fairness, actually wasn't generally done, or wasn't done on search. It was done in classification. So you have a binary classifier, and you want to make sure that the objects being classified are being classified based only on those attributes that it actually matters for the classification and not on auxiliary matters. And largely this was loans, whether personal characteristics of the person other than the financial ability to repay, was that being used. Mortgages was redlining, algorithmic redlining happening. And there were a couple other ones, but this was the idea that we're trying to classify whatever, but you wanted to make sure that the classification was based only on those factors which were actually germane to the problem at hand. The foundational work started on classification because A, it's easier than ranking, because it's more narrow. But even in this easier case, there's lots of literature out there that shows there are at least 20 different definitions of fairness. And they're reasonable definitions. If I just told you one of them, you would think, yeah, okay, that's a reasonable definition of fairness. And if I told you another one, you would think, yeah, okay, that's a reasonable definition. And they're mutually exclusive. You can't satisfy all of them at the same time. Okay? So you've got a problem. Right, Houston, we've got a problem here. There's the different definitions have to come in with how you deal with individual things to be classified. So individual versus group. So are you looking at fairness of women as a whole versus men as a whole, or are you looking for fairness at Ellen versus Simon? Right. And as I say, all of these definitions in the abstract seem very sensible and very reasonable as definitions of fairness, but you can't satisfy them all at the same time. There's also this issue of intersectionality, which basically means if you're concerned about gender and race, an algorithm which is fair for gender and fair for race is not necessarily fair for gender and race. Okay, so it's a big morass, and some of this is fundamentally, provably shown not possible to do it all. Okay, so keep that in mind. This foundational work also showed that there's a whole slew of different ways that bias comes in. It's almost, no, I shouldn't say that. It's not only nefariousness by by algorithm developers. It's in society, it's in your data, it's in how you clean your data. It comes from all over the place. And the different types of harms, there's harms between actively being denied something, which is a distributional harm, versus a representational harm of, if you do a search, actually this was Scott, your example of when you have images coming back of people. Right? If you do a search for scientist, you're probably going to get a white male in a lab coat, right? And that's the type of thing that's a representational harm, is that there, a wide variety of people are missing from this representation. And there's also this idea between, are you worried about the impact or the treatment? The treatment is just sort of a more fundamental, this is, different people are being treated, or different subjects are being treated in different ways, versus there are following consequences for being treated in those different ways. So this table is taken directly from that book, but I thought it was really good. It's contrasting here, contrasting. All that work was on classification, but we're actually interested in this room in ranking. Right? And so what additional problems does ranking cause? And it causes a fair number, right? One is, in the classification, each thing being classified, there's a decision that's made on it, and it's independent of the decisions made on other items, and it's independent of who's asking, and it's independent of all of this, and none of that's true in ranking. Right? In ranking, you have a set of items that are going to be returned. Decisions on any one of those things being returned might affect whether or not something else is being returned. You are probably trying to personalize it for the particular user who's asking. And you have a wide, you have at least two, as we've been talking about, producers and consumers, at least two different sets of stakeholders who you're trying to be fair for. And so ranking is actually a harder problem. But the easier problem is not possible. Okay, so ranking is going to be harder too. So we have consumers who want effectiveness. We've got producers who want exposure. And so basically one way of formulating this is to consider exposure, where exposure here is you've got a set of ranks, say 10, and you're going to put items in those 10 ranks. Right? So it's a resource allocation problem, where the resources are the relevant items and the allocation part are these 10 ranks. And there are essentially, there are two main ways that this problem is being looked at these days, and they end up looking sort of at the end reasonably similar, but they come from very different underlying foundational, I shouldn't use foundational, underlying ways of developing the problem. And the first is the approach that was used in the TREC track. And in the TREC track, we wanted fair exposure, which has to be done in the aggregate, right? Because for any one user in one search, there was 10 slots there, and somebody got, in those 10 slots, and you can't do anything about fairness in that one ranking. So in the fair exposure, everything is being treated in the aggregate over a set of rankings for the same query, right? So the first time the query is issued, you get a ranking of the top X, say 10 documents. The second time that question is issued, be it by the same person or not, you would like it to be a different ranking, still of relevant items, but different items in those ranks. That, of course, assumes that you have at least more than 10 relevant items. Okay. The other formulation is called pairwise fairness, and that just says in the formulation of the problem that the probability of an item of higher relevance is ranked before one with a lower relevance is conditionally independent upon the producer of the item. Okay? That just means basically the system is blind to who produced it. You're always going to rank relevant items before non-relevant items, and yet you aren't going to preferentially rank any of those relevant items. Okay? As I said, these are two different approaches from their development. They end up being pretty much the same thing in net result, in that you're trying to make sure that you're not always returning the same thing for the same query. All right, so this is somewhat of an aside because that's basically what we had there. Notice though, so there's a couple of, we have huge problems here which I have nicely glided over, and none of you called me out on it. Which is, you don't know what the relevant items are, right? If you knew that, we would be a lot further along, right? So here you have to do this all in this highly uncertain environment where you're not even sure what the relevant items are. Now there's lots of well-established ways of improving effectiveness, which accuracy, right, which retrieving relevant items. And one of those main ways is relevance feedback in whatever guise you want to do it. I know it from Rokio, but you can do it from learning to rank, or you can do, whatever way you're doing it. Relevance feedback is, here I know I have relevant items here because the user has told me so, or I have imputed so. I want to go retrieve items that look exactly like that. because those are the relevant ones, right? But what does that do? Your system doesn't know why those items were relevant, right? So you're going to retrieve the same item, the same set of papers from the same set of authors, from the same institutions, right? And so all of these methods, which are specifically designed to retrieve more relevant items that look like this, are going to be miserable for the problem of fairness. Because on purpose, you're trying to make it look like what you've retrieved before. Okay? All right, so what's a search engine owner to do? Well, I don't have any good real ideas for you here. I mean, I have some ideas here, but I don't have any answers for you. One thing is clear is you have to be very specific about what it is that you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. There is no such thing as a generically fair algorithm, right? That's from 20 different definitions of fairness. Can't satisfy them all. What is it that you're actually trying to do, and why do you care, right? So there's good reasons to care. I gave an earlier version of this talk to the National Library of Medicine, who have this real problem of being an ex-government employee. I can tell you that this is real. The powers that be have said that their algorithm will be fair, right? But why, and in how, and in what way? And there's good reason for wanting it to be fair. You want it to have good balance between genders of papers being, of authors of papers, right? It's really, really important to the career of people writing papers that the National Libraries of Medicine's midline system is going to rank, that their papers be found, right? And historically, they're working on this, but historically, one of the main signals is the quality of the author, right? But that's another one of these effects of you keep getting retrieved because you've been retrieved. And so you have to decide what it is that you're going to actually focus on, and how you're going to know that you've achieved what you wanted, right? So what data do you need, right? And that was brought up before too. What data do you need to know to decide whether or not you are being fair, or can you in fact tell, do you have the data that you need to know, apart from any algorithm development, that you're accomplishing what you want, and that your algorithm can use that data, right? So back to the TREC track. The reason that those two tasks were used, and there was sort of peculiar data, right, and tracks, was because the TREC track had hard trouble finding a definition of fairness and data that would go with it to actually be used even in a TREC track. TREC tracks are not real search in that sense, right? I mean, we can go ask people for things, and it's static and stuff. You are going to have a system that is ongoing. You'll have more control over it probably than we do, than TREC did. But can you get this data, right? If you want to use gender as one of the things that you care about, how are you going to know what the genders are, right? It's problematic to impute gender from name. But that's all you have, probably. I mean, it's probably the case that your authorship doesn't say I am a woman, or I am not comfortable saying, or gender, or whatever, right? So how are you going to know? How do you get this data? So that wasn't really helpful for me either, right? I'm just throwing more problems out. Maybe there's some low-hanging fruit that you can do originally, right? So maybe you can look at what you want and what you have. And if you know a set of items for say, for a head queries or at least or something, you have a set of items, you know these are relevant, and you just randomize which order they appear in for each query. I mean, that will help your fairness, but it will annoy your users, right? So users like consistent results. If they go query once, they're going to be concerned if they keep getting different answers each time. So what do you care about more? That's going to be up to you and up to what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So I'll stop there. I can answer questions if anybody has questions.
You mentioned a variety of different fairness functions of which, because they're mutually exclusive, you can't meet all of them at the same time. Is it possible to measure, given a fairness function, the fairness of a given search system?
So yes, with an asterisk, right? Assuming that you have the data, there are a variety of different measures. There are always a variety of measures, right? So there are measures that you can go and can compute. And one of my previous slides, I had what the fairness track used, and I ignored it in this talk because it's complicated and hairy, but because you're taking expectations over different ranking or different times that the query gets issued. But the literature does have measures out there for computing the fairness of a system over a given set of rankings. There's a lot of assumptions built into that, right? The biggest being that you have the data, and the data is actually correct and representative of what you need. Okay, thanks very much.